All right. How's it going?
Hi.
Yes. Hey, Queen Buri. We'll hear the joyful squeals of Queen Buri as he runs back and forth. But cool. We are going. This is the first session of the Hebrew study we're going to do for this year. So we'll just be doing one chapter every single month. So fourth Wednesday of each month, we're going to be doing a chapter. So this week we'll do chapter 1. And then next month we'll do chapter 2. So what we'll do is start with a little bit of context on the book of Hebrews. I'll try and look around. I'm thinking if I should look here, look at the people who are over here. So we'll do a little bit of both. But we'll start a little bit of context on the book of Hebrews and then talk a little bit about chapter 1 and then spend most of our time doing a little bit of discussion. There'll be some questions that we can go through. But just some discussions about how that chapter of Hebrews relates to, just life and ways in which we can identify with some of the things they're going through. So, to start off, the book of Hebrews, the audience of the book of Hebrews, it's written to believing Jews in Jerusalem. So you have one of the first set of groups of people who believed were Jews. So the gospel goes to the Jews. They're in Jerusalem, they believe. And what happens now is that you have a small minority of Jews who believe in Jesus the Messiah, and then a large majority of Jews who don't. And then now this group, who is now forming this church, have been ostracized by the rest of the Jewish community. So a huge part of life as a Jew was all the temple sacrifices, all the customs, all the feasts, everything in the Old Testament. You understand that all this is part of the shared history of this Jewish people. So to be ostracized by your family, to be cut off from the temple, would be a huge part of your culture that's lost. So the Jews held to the feasts and the sacrifices as ways that they would be right before God. So they would go into the temple on the Day of Atonement, and all the way until today, all of those same feasts and sacrifices, so like Rosh Hashanah, for example, is a feast, and it's like a feast of ingathering, where Jews would come together to reflect on their lives and see ways in which their lives are not reflecting what God is calling them to. And then that would lead to Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement, which is when now there would be an atonement for sin. So all the different, or like Passover, so all those are feasts that are still celebrated today. And they reflect the history of the people. So Passover being when the Jews are escaping slavery in Egypt. The Day of Atonement when the Lord is atoning for their sins. All these are part of the shared history of the people. So in this time, at the beginning of the early church, if you're a Jew who then converts to Christianity and now says that Jesus is the Messiah that other feasts like Rosh Hashanah is pointing to, that we're going to have a Messiah who's going to come, who's going to judge the righteous and the wicked, and to say, I believe this Jesus is the Messiah, and the large majority of your community doesn't believe that, then you would be ostracized. You would be considered an apostate. You are rejecting your culture, your history, your people, your religion, because these practices would hold this Jewish community together. There's a cohesion. And so even in the temple, so Jews would go to the temple many times a year. And in the temple, you had the inner court where the Jews would go in. You had the outer court for the Gentiles who would want to associate with the God of the Jews. But if you converted to be a Christian Jew who believes in the Messiah as Jesus Christ, you wouldn't even be allowed into the outer court. You would be considered as further away from God than a Gentile. So to believe in Jesus would come at a huge cost. Personally, as a Jew, because you have the Roman Empire that's opposed to Christians, because you're saying that Jesus is the king. And then you have your family and your community that's ostracizing you because they believe that you have turned away from the faith. So that's the community that this book is being written to. You have Jews who are asking themselves, is it still worth it for me to believe in this Jesus? Does it still make sense for me to give up all these things? Should I just listen to my family that's saying, we have the Old Testament scriptures, we have the Torah, we have everything that is passed down from your ancestors. This is what we have. You might be mistaken. We still have all these shared history. Why don't you just come back and continue to do these customs, continue to do the sacrifices? Not that Christianity says that these customs are bad. Christianity was saying that these don't justify you before the Lord. And so now there's no difference between Jew and Gentile in terms of our standing before the Lord. But you now have the temptation to say, man, why don't I just go back to what I was doing before? And so the book of Hebrews is written to a people undergoing persecution, oppression for what they believe. And the book of Hebrews is written to show that Jesus really is more excellent than anything that you have lost. So oftentimes in the book of Hebrews, you'll see they say things like Jesus is superior to, or better than, or more excellent than, and starts off with he's more excellent than the prophets, more excellent than angels. He is greater than Moses. He is greater than the temple sacrifices. And then the book often looks forward to say, look at all the things that you are gaining in Christ. So it says, we have this new high priest that's greater. We have this new temple. We have this new mountain. So there are all these things that this writer is trying to encourage and to comfort the Jews in what they're going through, to let them know that your belief in Jesus really is worth it for what you are going through. So that's a little bit of the context in that. The author of Hebrews is anonymous, so doesn't state who they are. But the idea is that the idea is that he's writing to this church, and in the early part of the book of Acts, you have that same church that ends up being persecuted because of the testimony of Stephen. So Stephen, one of the first deacons, testifies, and there's a huge persecution in the Jewish church, and they get scattered across the different parts of the world, and that's how a lot of the gospel goes forward. So this book is being written to this community of Jews and all that they're facing. So we'll jump right into Hebrews chapter 1. I'll try and go through relatively quickly so that we can spend a good amount of time talking through what this first chapter speaks about. And so one thing that you'll see in the book of Hebrews, because he's writing to the Jews, there is a lot of Old Testament scriptures that's being referred to. So oftentimes there's pretty dense references and texts that are being brought up. And so that's a lot of what we see also in chapter 1. So in chapter 1, the first 3 verses, the author of the book to the Hebrew church is referring to how Jesus is greater than the prophets. And let's actually take a second. Let's actually read through verses 1 to 14 together. If you have the CSB chapter 1, let's read through the first 14 verses, and then we'll just go through each of them, and then we'll take some time to talk about it. If we could read together, 1, 2, 3. Long ago, God spoke to the fathers by the prophets at different times and in different ways. In these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. God has appointed him heir of all things and made the universe through him. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact expression of his nature, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. So he became superior to the angels, just as the name he inherited is more excellent than theirs. For to which of the angels did he ever say, "You are my son, today I have become your father"? Or again, "I will be his father, and he will be my son"? Again,
when he brings his firstborn into the world, he says, and let all God's angels worship him. And about the angels, he says, he makes his angels winds, and his servants a fiery flame. But to the Son, your throne, O God, is forever and ever, and the scepter of your kingdom is the scepter of justice. You have loved righteousness and hated lawlessness. This is why God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of joy beyond your companions. And in the beginning, Lord, you established the earth, and the heavens are the works of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. They will all wear out like clothing. You will roll them up like a cloak, and they will be changed like clothing. But you are the same, and your years will never end. Now to which of the angels has he ever said, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool? Are they not all ministering spirits sent out to serve those who are going to inherit salvation?
It's great. And so he starts off comparing Jesus to the prophets. And so he says that God spoke to our ancestors by the prophets at different times and in different ways. In the last days, he's spoken to us by his Son. So he starts off by talking about how God spoke to the ancestors or to the fathers through the prophets, and now he's speaking to us by his Son. And he's going to compare both the way God spoke to the ancestors and the way he speaks to us now. So through the prophets, it's different times in different ways. And so the Jews would know all the different prophets that came before and how they spoke to our ancestors. They spoke particular messages at a particular time while those prophets were alive to the people. And sometimes God would speak in different ways. Sometimes he'd speak from a cloud. Sometimes he'd speak from a pillar of fire. And the author starts off by talking about how as God has spoken to our ancestors through the prophets, he's now spoken to us through his Son. And the difference here being the prophets and Jesus being the Son of God. God has appointed him heir of all things and made the universe through him. So not only is he now the Son, so not just a prophet, but the span of life that Jesus has is that he has predated the prophets. So he's been there from creation, and he will be there to inherit all things that's been made. So on the one hand, there's that temporary way in which the prophets spoke, and now there's the much more weighty revelation that Jesus brings because he has been there from the beginning of time. But here the author of Hebrews also wants to affirm the fact that this is not a different message. So Jesus isn't coming in to negate all that has come before. God spoke through the prophets, and now he's speaking through his Son. So it's a much more weighty message. And it says later on in verse 3, the Son is the radiance of God's glory, the exact expression of his nature, sustaining all things by his powerful word. So again, in comparison to the prophets, none of the prophets would say of themselves that I am radiating God's glory. But the author is saying that Jesus is the very glory of God. So not only is he the Son of God, he's the very glory of God. And to the question of whether or not Jesus is bringing a different message than the prophets did, if he's speaking in tune with his Father, the author says Jesus is the exact expression of the nature of God. So he has existed from before the prophets. And the implication is if he created all things, he created the prophets themselves. He is the radiance of God's glory, and is the exact expression of God. So if you're confused as to whether or not this Jesus can be trusted, or if the message that this Jesus is bringing forward really is the message of God, then the author is saying to his audience, he is the exact expression of God. The exact, or none of the prophets would say that about themselves. But the author is saying that of Jesus.
That's good.
It says he sustains all things by his powerful word. And oftentimes you'll see throughout the book of Hebrews, in this chapter, there is a particular focus on creation. Because for the Jews and for the Hebrews, their story begins in creation. So anything that's a revelation of God would oftentimes begin with what God did in creation. And so you have here that Jesus, or God, has made all things through the Son. And as you're reading this as a Hebrew who knows the scriptures, and you're remembering the story of creation, you're remembering that God merely spoke and all things came into existence. And then now he puts this creative power of speech onto the Son, that he's the radiance of God's glory, the exact expression of his nature, and he sustains all things by his powerful word. So you have now Jesus, who's been set up as he predates creation, he's going to inherit all things, and he sustains everything by his word. It's pretty like, 3 verses, and it's like, this is amazing. This Jesus that we're speaking about is more than you can imagine. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. And I wonder how that would fall on these readers who might have been excluded from the temple. So excluded from the temple, you can't go in and have your sins purified. You can't. And then you're considered even more unclean because you're just staying out there in sin. And the author puts in there that after Jesus completed a once and for all purification for sins, he sits down, and he sits down at the right hand of the Father, or the right hand of the Majesty on high. And that idea of the right hand means that we are co-governing, we are ruling together. So Jesus is the Son, he's achieved purification for sins, and now he's seated alongside God, ruling the world together with him. In verse 4, so he became superior to the angels, just as the name he inherited is more excellent than theirs. And the idea of Jesus being greater than angels is related to God's revelation of himself to people. So you see later on in chapter 2, it's the belief on how even the law was brought to Moses is that it was from God through angels to Moses. So there's very much an attachment of angels were the ones who brought the law. So the author has spoken about how Jesus is greater than the prophets. And now he's speaking about how Jesus is greater than the angels, the most dignified of divine beings, the ones who brought the law. You have the author wanting to assure them, no, this Jesus really is greater than these angels. And so what he does after that, from verse 5 all the way down to verse 13, is he gives 7 quotations from the Old Testament. That was a number that was important to the Jews. 7 is a number of completion. So the author is intentional. 7 different ways in which Jesus is greater than the angels. So we talked about how he's greater than the prophets and is greater than the angels. In verse 5, for to which of the angels did he ever say? And that's one thing that we're going to look at, is the number of times that the author refers to God saying something. So we already talked about how he speaks to the prophets, and now he's spoken through his Son. And now he's going to say over and over and over again, this is what God said. Because he wants them to know all this is part of the scriptures. This is what God has said. Verse 5, to which of the angels did he ever say, you are my son, today I have become your father? Or again, I will be his father and he will be my son. So the first difference, Jesus is a son, and that's not said of any angel. The second thing, verse 6, again, when he brings his firstborn into the world, he says, let all God's angels worship him. So the second way in which Jesus, greater than these angels, is that when Jesus is sent into the world, God says, let all the angels worship Jesus. In verse 7, and about the angels he says, he makes his angels winds and his servants a fiery flame. Right, so the third thing here then is that the angels are servants sent out by God, while Jesus is a son who's been sent by God. Verse 8, but to the Son, your throne, God, is forever and ever. The scepter of your kingdom is a scepter of justice. You have loved righteousness and hated lawlessness. This is why God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of joy beyond your companions. So while the angels are servants, the Son is a king. So he is a prophet, but he's greater than a prophet. He's a priest who achieves purification, but he's greater than the priests. And he is a king, not just an earthly king, but a king who has an eternal kingdom.
Yeah, it's good.
Your throne, God, is forever and ever.
Yeah.
The scepter or the sign of your ruling is the scepter of justice. Imagine how this would land on these Hebrew listeners who've experienced being ostracized by their community and have suffered injustices at the hands of Rome and of their Jewish community. To hear that Jesus is a son and a king, and the foundation of his kingdom is justice and righteousness, would be something that I think would be encouraging to hear, that this is someone that I can believe in and place my hope in. In verse 10, and in the beginning, Lord, you established the earth. Again, talking about the creation narrative. You established the earth, and the heavens are the works of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. They will all wear out like clothing. You will roll them up like a cloak, and they will be changed like clothing. But you are the same, and your years will never end. So the sense in which here, while Jesus was there for the beginning of creation, so all the way past before the prophets, everything that has been created is going to perish. Everything that's been created, the way he says it is, it's like a cloak that you will take out and put in your closet. Like you will roll it up, you will put it away, and all of creation will be changed. But you, Jesus, you're going to remain the same. This is not a different message from God. The same God who gave the message of the law is Jesus, who has the same message. Like you remain the same. So they will perish, but you remain. They will wear out like clothing. You will roll them up like a cloak. So Jesus here is eternal. From eternity past to the future in eternity, he will remain. All things that we see are going to perish. He will remain. And the final thing, to which of the angels has he said, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. So 7 different ways in which Jesus is different and greater than the angels, ways in which Jesus is greater than the prophets. And then verse 14, are they not all ministering spirits sent to serve those who are going to inherit salvation? So that's a quick overview on the chapter. Let's take some time. We have some questions that we'll pass out, and I'm actually going to make sure I can share it on the Zoom. That we can take some time to just talk through what are the ways that we think this message landed on or in the ears of these Hebrew listeners, these believers in Christ who are maybe doubting their salvation, unsure about how to proceed. We'll talk through some of that and then maybe how that impacts and relates to us today. Because it's always a situation where to hold to the testimony of God, testimony of Christ, there's almost an assurance that Christ gives that you will face some measure of being ostracized. So let's talk through some of that. I'll send the link over in Zoom, and then maybe we can figure out. I don't know if you wanna like. Maybe if you talk through, if you the Zoom people, and then we'll work through here. Amazing. Perfect. Thanks, bro.
You're welcome, man. That's awesome. Do you want to email it and I'll get it and then I'll get it to everybody? Okay. All right.
Oh, you saw that? I see everything's the photo on my phone. So.
Okay.
I know.
All right. Hey, y'all. Can y'all see me?